Here is a powerful cinematic intro for your topic, written in a dark historical storytelling style, while keeping it suspenseful and mysterious. In the forgotten shadows of America's blood-soaked past, where chains clattered louder than prayers and silence swallowed the cries of the broken, there emerged a legend so terrifying that even slave masters refused to speak its name after sundown. They called him a ghost, a curse, a force sent by the wrath of the earth itself. He was a slave with no recorded face, no confirmed name, and no known grave. Yet the trail he left behind was measured in fear, vanished men and whispers that echoed through generations. Plantation by plantation, county by county, stories spread like wildfire through the white corridors of power. Overseers found dead in fields, patrolmen discovered lifeless beside dusty roads, armed men who rode out at night never returned by morning. The official record spoke of accidents, of unknown assailants, of unfortunate circumstances, but the truth lived in trembling voices and locked doors. They said a single enslaved man was responsible. They said 200 white men vanished or were found dead, yet no prison ever held him, no rope ever found his neck. How could one man bound by chains and surrounded by cruelty outsmart an entire system built to crush him? How could someone with nothing become the greatest terror of those who owned everything? Was he real, or was he a myth born from guilt and fear, a silent protector of the oppressed, or a vengeance-driven specter moving through the night? No witness ever saw him clearly, no authority ever proved his existence, and yet every plantation along the river knew the story of the slave who turned the hunt into a nightmare, who made the masters afraid of the dark, who became an impossible mystery that history tried to bury but could never erase. The nameless enslaved man did not arrive in history as a hero or a villain, but as a rumor that crept along the edges of burning fields and moonlit dirt roads, carried in hushed voices that trembled with disbelief and dread, a figure with no birth record, no documented lineage, no traceable origin, only the echo of footsteps that seemed to follow the men who believed themselves untouchable, the men who walked with loaded pistols and the certainty of power, the men who slept in grand houses while others slept on bare ground, and yet it was their sleep that grew restless, their confidence that began to fracture, their certainty that slowly dissolved into paranoia and whispered prayer. They said he was once just another body bent under the sun, another pair of hands blistered by rope and cotton, another soul expected to break quietly. But somewhere between the crack of the overseer's whip and the cold iron of shackles, something inside him refused to collapse, something sharp and silent and patient, something that watched, remembered and waited. And when the first white man was found dead in the shadow of the tree, the story did not carry a name, only a warning that felt too deliberate to ignore. At first it was dismissed as coincidence, a tragic accident, an unfortunate incident blamed on drunken missteps or unseen animals. But when the second body appeared and then the third, when strong men failed to return from night patrols, when confident riders vanished between 1 mile marker and the next, the language changed from logic to rumor, from reason to unease, and somewhere in that change, the name of a slave, though unknown, began to take shape in fearful imagination. No one could describe his face, only the sensation he left behind, a presence like cold air slipping through a locked door, a disturbance felt more than seen, and the more the deaths mounted, the more the legends swelled, fed by whispers from the enslaved and curses from the masters, fed by the uneasy silence that followed every unanswered disappearance, fed by the growing realization that the system built on dominance had been pierced by something it could not command. They spoke of a man who moved like smoke through cane fields, who vanished before dawn like a dream too dark to remember clearly, who knew every inch of land better than the men who claimed to own it, and with each retelling the number grew, 10, 20, 50, then a number so large it seemed impossible, 200, a figure that sounded less like history and more like a nightmare told around low fires. Yet the fear on the faces of those who repeated it made the impossible feel dangerously real. The nameless one became more than a person. He became a symbol stuck between terror and secret admiration, cursed in the big houses and silently revered in the court, a figure who bent the rigid narrative of power, who suggested that even in chains there could exist a terrifying defiance, one that moved in silence, one that did not announce itself, one that unsettled the foundations of control without ever stepping into the light. Patrols increased, rifles multiplied, rewards were promised to anyone who could offer a description, yet all they ever received were contradictions and ghost stories. A tall shadow, a low whisper, a shape that dissolved before it could be named. The frustration of authorities growing sharper as each attempt collapsed into another unanswered question, each search ending in empty woods and deeper fear. Men who once laughed loudly now spoke in cautious tones. Doors that once stood open now creaked shut before nightfall, and the idea of dominance became brittle. as if a single unseen force had turned confidence into caution, strength into trembling vigilance, and no matter how many times the story was denied in official records, it lived stubbornly in the atmosphere, thick and inescapable. The enslaved whispered his legend as both a warning and a fragile hope, a story told in fragments, carried from mouth to mouth like a secret that dared to exist, shaping an unseen mythology where the powerless briefly imagined resistance, and yet even they could not say whether he was flesh or spirit, whether he walked or drifted, whether he was real or simply the echo of a collective longing for retribution. What made him more terrifying was not the alleged number but the absence of proof, the void where a name should have, the silence where a face should have existed, a mystery that refused to solidify into certainty, leaving behind only the remnants of fear and speculation, a narrative that twisted itself deeper into the psyche of an era built on control. The legend grew taller with every retelling, darker with every passing year, until the nameless enslaved man no longer belonged to time but to folklore, an embodiment of tension, rage, and unresolved injustice, a walking question that history could not answer and authority could not silence, existing in that uneasy space where fact dissolves into myth, and myth feeds upon suppressed truths, a figure who walked without acknowledgement, who struck without recognition, who existed without documentation, a presence that lingered in memory, in trembling account, in the quiet moments when even the most powerful sensed they were not as untouchable as they believed. And the story continued, stretching forward through generations, shaped by fear, curiosity, and the uneasy awareness that somewhere beneath the official narrative, something ancient, and dangerous had once moved silently through the night, leaving behind only whispers, shadows, and unanswered certainty that refused to fade into silence, even as the world desperately tried to pretend it never happened, and the legend kept breathing in the spaces between truth and terror, between control and rebellion, between what was recorded and what was only ever felt, stretching onward without a final closure, without a declared ending, without a moment of resolution, only the persistent sense that the nameless enslaved man was still walking somewhere in the forgotten corners of memory, still a rumor, still a haunting presence, still a question that never fully rested, still a legend that refused to die, still an echo that traveled through time, still a shadow stretching longer than history cared to admit, still alive in the pause between fear and belief, still moving through the silence of an unsettled past where the line between myth and reality blurred endlessly into the darkness of unspoken truths and trembling recollections of a ghost that never asked to be remembered but would never allow himself to be erased. White authorities did not fear an enemy they could see, they feared the possibility that somewhere beyond their reach existed a mind that understood their movements better than they understood themselves, and this fear grew sharper with every failed attempt to define him, to outline him, to drag him out of myth and into chains. A system that prided itself on control suddenly faced a presence it could not classify, could not number, and could not corner, and in that uncertainty their authority began to feel strangely hollow. Men in tailored coats and polished boots gathered in dimly lit offices, poring over maps and ledgers, tracing routes with trembling fingers, circling locations where bodies had been found or men had vanished, convinced that logic alone could trap him, that order could dominate chaos. Yet every plan collapsed into silence, every pursuit ending with nothing but disturbed soil and unanswered questions that seemed to mock their efforts. They sent patrols into the woods at dusk, doubling their number, sharpening their weapons, issuing strict instructions to shoot first and ask later. Yet the night swallowed them whole, and dawn returned only fragments of their certainty, sometimes a missing rider, sometimes an abandoned horse, sometimes a shaken man unable to explain what he had seen or heard, only the sense that something had watched them from beyond the line of fire. Official reports began to speak in vague language, careful words that avoided panic yet revealed unease, terms like unknown assailant, external disturbance, unfortunate incident, and behind each phrase lay the unspoken admission that the system had no answer for a force it could neither name nor prove, no visible enemy to parade as a warning, no body to display as a symbol of regained control. Rewards were announced, bold sums offered to anyone who could provide information, sketches requested from frightened witnesses who could remember everything except a face, a height, a clear silhouette, and every description contradicted the last, one claiming he was tall, another that he moved low to the ground, some saying he walked upright, others swearing he crawled through the brush like an animal, and none of it formed into anything solid enough to pursue. The more they searched, the more the landscape seemed to betray them. Familiar roads turned confusing, paths once clear became tangled, and the very land they claimed to own now appeared to shelter the one they wished to destroy, as if the soil itself had chosen defiance over submission, and each failure carved deeper lines into their confidence. Some began to whisper that he was not entirely human, that no mortal man could evade so many trained eyes, that perhaps he was protected by something unseen, a spirit of vengeance or the embodiment of suppressed rage, while others clung desperately to rational explanations, blaming drifters, escaped prisoners, or foreign saboteurs, anything that allowed them to avoid the more terrifying truth that a single enslaved man could be beyond their grasp. Night after night, strategists revised their methods, traps laid, informants recruited, threats issued to the enslaved communities demanding cooperation, yet fear seeped through every command, and even the most hardened officers felt a strange hesitation when venturing beyond the safe boundaries of light, as though their uniforms offered no real protection against something that could not be defined. What disturbed them most was not just the inability to capture him, but the inability to even fully agree on whether he truly existed. And this uncertainty gnawed at the foundation of power, because power depended on clarity, on hierarchy, on visible dominance. And here was a presence that dismantled all three, a shadow that refused to obey the rules of visibility and obedience. Some officials dismissed the entire matter as folklore, exaggerated tales spun by fearful men and restless slaves. Yet even their dismissal was laced with unease, for behind closed doors they too lowered their voices, secured their windows, and questioned guards with an intensity that betrayed belief disguised as skepticism. And every denial felt thinner than the night air it tried to control. Records grew thicker, filled with annotations and conflicting testimonies. Yet no conclusive evidence ever formed, no arrest to justify the manhunts, no victorious capture to restore authority's image, only an expanding presence in rumor and imagination, a void where certainty should have lived, a space where fear thrived unchecked. The failure to identify him became more than a procedural embarrassment. It became a psychological wound, a reminder that control had limits, that even the most rigid system could be outmaneuvered by something it refused to understand. And in that refusal it found itself chasing, not a man but a concept, not a criminal but an idea that slipped through every net cast upon it. As months turned into years, the pursuit transformed into obsession, yet obsession without resolution, ambition without achievement, and every new strategy felt hollow before it even began, because the legend had grown larger than the reality it may or may not have stemmed from, and the man, real or imagined, now existed beyond the grasp of rope, bullet, or decree. Fear began to legislate behavior, altering routines, changing patrol hours, influencing decisions that once seemed fixed, and the very structure of authority bent slightly under the invisible pressure of uncertainty, as though a single unseen figure had forced the entire machine of power to question its own invincibility. No capture, no confession, no undeniable trace ever surfaced, and so the question lingered suspended in the air like a storm that never broke, haunting every search, every failed attempt, every frustrated order, leaving behind only a trail of dread and an unshakable awareness that somewhere beyond their reach, beyond their law, beyond their understanding, something remained untamed, unclaimed, unresolved, moving through the cracks of control, slipping through the fingers of those who had never known what it meant to lose their grasp on certainty. And still the mystery stretched onward, heavier with each unanswered inquiry, darker with each unsuccessful pursuit, a nameless presence that quietly dismantled the illusion of absolute authority, exposing the fragility beneath its polished exterior, whispering without words that not everything could be owned, not everything could be dominated, not everything would ever step willingly into the light of submission and compliance. And that realization lingered like an unbroken tension in the air, feeding the growing unease that authority itself could one day be eclipsed by the very shadows it once believed it controlled. Fear did not announce its arrival with a single moment, but seeped slowly into every corner of plantation life, altering the rhythm of days and the silence of nights, until even the most powerful men began to feel like occupants rather than rulers, their confidence eroding as whispers traveled faster than order, as the echo of rumored danger nested itself into the collective consciousness of those who once believed nothing could challenge their control. The change was subtle at first, a nervous pause before stepping outside after sundown, a longer glance toward the tree line, a tightening grip around lantern handles. But soon it grew into something heavier, a tension that hovered in every conversation and every breath, transforming the open expanse of land into a territory of suspicion where every shadow felt alive and every rustle felt intentional. White masters who had once walked their grounds with arrogant ease, now paced their porches with restless caution, listening for sounds that might never come yet feeling watched all the same, their authority shifting from dominance to defense, their posture from command to guarded vigilance. And in that shift, the narrative of power quietly fractured.
Servants noticed the change before anyone dared to acknowledge it aloud. The way voices softened after dark. The way orders were delivered with sharp impatience rather than calm assurance. The way overseers hesitated before venturing far from the main house. And the way patrols returned more shaken than triumphant, their eyes wide with stories they refused to fully explain. Night became a different entity, no longer a time of rest but a realm of uncertainty, where imagination prowled alongside unseen threats, and the men who once mocked superstition now clung to superstition with desperate sincerity, avoiding certain paths, refusing to ride alone, insisting on torches even when the moon spilled silver light across the fields. Conversations changed tone, shifting from confident declarations to careful speculation, and the laughter that once echoed across verandas now sounded strained and hollow, every joke laced with underlying discomfort, every boast dulled by the awareness that something they could not control might be lingering just beyond their sight. The rumor of a single figure unsettled entire households, turning families inward, prompting extra locks, more guards, stricter rules, and sleepless nights filled with strained listening, and no amount of reassurance could dismantle the creeping belief that their world had become vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. Plantation children were pulled indoors sooner than before, wives lingered anxiously by candlelight, and the act of closing doors became ritualistically precise, every bolt and latch a fragile attempt to seal out the uncertainty that pressed against the night air. And even within those walls security felt temporary, brittle, like glass stretched too thin. Men who prided themselves on bravery found themselves inventing reasons to delay evening rides, assigning duties to others, volunteering to stay closer to the safety of lamps and walls, and this quiet avoidance spoke louder than any confession of fear, exposing the silent shift in their perception of invincibility. The environment responded to their unease, or perhaps it had always been this way and they were only now noticing. The wind sounded sharper, the trees whispered longer, the insects hummed in patterns that felt deliberate, and the land itself seemed to carry a quiet awareness that unsettled the very men who claimed it as property. What troubled them most was not the idea of death, but the idea of unpredictability, the knowledge that their power no longer guaranteed safety, that their laws no longer felt absolute, even their guns could not promise certainty against something that dissolved before it could be confronted. Fear reshaped posture, reshaped language, reshaped the way men looked at one another, questioning their strength, measuring their resolve, wondering who among them would be bold enough to step where shadows thickened. And with every hesitation the legend grew stronger, feeding on their anxiety like air breathed into flames. The enslaved observed this transformation quietly, recognizing the tremor beneath authority's surface, understanding that the fear haunting their oppressors was a subtle reversal of the terror they themselves had long endured. And although they spoke of it cautiously, the knowledge that their masters now tasted unease created a fragile shift in perception. No one could claim certainty anymore, no one could pretend absolute command, and the politics of fear began to govern not only the enslaved but the enslavers, drawing them into the same psychological prison they had engineered for others. Though their chains were intangible, forged from rumor and sleepless paranoia, the sense of dominance deteriorated into a state of constant anticipation. Every sound an interruption, every silence a warning, and this perpetual alertness drained what had once felt like unquestionable power, exposing a raw vulnerability that power itself had tried so carefully to conceal. Even daylight could not fully lift the weight of night's tension, and morning arrived not as relief, but as temporary reprieve, the hours slowly ticking toward the next dusk, the next uncertain darkness, the next confrontation with something unnamed yet ever present. The idea that a single unknown figure could force such widespread unease unsettled their sense of hierarchy, proving that control existed only as long as it went on. And now it was being challenged not by armies or revolts, but by an invisible presence that lived in rumor, silence, and collective dread. In that environment, fear became a shared experience among those who once believed themselves untouchable, transforming their confidence into questioning, their certainty into doubt, their authority into something hollow and reactive rather than dominant and assured. And in that space of fragile power the legend continued to grow, feeding on every cautious step, every sleepless night, every hushed conversation, reinforcing the reality that terror did not need visibility to rule, that power could be shaken by what it could not fully see, and that the greatest prison they now inhabited was not built of stone or iron, but carved deeply into their own unsettled minds, where uncertainty walked freely, and control dared not follow.
Myth and reality entwined so tightly around his story that no one could separate where truth ended and imagination began. And this uncertainty became the most powerful element of all. A fog that settled over every attempt to define what had happened, every effort to explain how a single presence could inspire such widespread unease, leaving behind only fragments that shifted depending on who told them and who dared to listen. Some swore he was nothing more than a tale exaggerated by fear, a convenient phantom created to explain a series of unrelated tragedies, while others insisted with trembling conviction that they had seen him, just for a breath of a moment, a shadow bending against the pale glow of moonlight, a movement too calculated to be coincidence, a presence too intentional to be dismissed as illusion. In this space between belief and denial, the narrative began to reflect deeper tensions, the quiet resentment buried beneath centuries of oppression, the longing for justice that could not be spoken openly, the suppressed anger that found expression in whispers rather than declarations, and through this lens the nameless figure transformed into something symbolic, a vessel for all that had been silenced, all that had been forced to bow without acknowledgement. Among the enslaved, his story carried a different weight, less of pure terror and more of conflicted reflection, for within the fear existed a faint suggestion of defiance, a possibility that the immovable could be challenged, that the unshakable could tremble, and this idea lingered like a fragile spark that could not be spoken too loudly yet could not be entirely extinguished. Those who benefited from the system spoke of him as a criminal force, a threat to order, a danger that needed to be erased from both land and memory, yet their condemnation was layered with unease, for the very existence of such a legend questioned the righteousness of their world, suggesting that violence did not live solely in rebellion but was already deeply embedded in the structure they called civilization. Was he a monster born from cruelty, or a spirit forged by suffering, a blade sharpened by injustice, or a mind driven solely by rage? And in these questions lay the uncomfortable realization that the line between vengeance and justice was not as clear as authority wished to believe, that the narrative of good and evil blurred when viewed through the eyes of those who had endured unrelenting chains. Some storytellers framed him as a protector, moving silently through darkness to even an unbalanced scale, others as a relentless specter consumed by wrath, but no version ever settled fully into certainty, each retelling altering the shape of his identity, each voice adding new shadows to the already obscured outline of his existence. Time stretched, and with it the legend evolved, absorbing elements of folklore, superstition, and cultural memory, blending fact with imagination until he became less a man, and more an embodiment of unresolved history, a character suspended between two worlds, between what was recorded and what was only felt, between documented cruelty and whispered resistance. The more history tried to erase, the more persistent the echoes became, as though silence itself refused to cooperate, leaving gaps in records that spoke louder than words, absences that suggested deliberate omission, the quiet refusal of official narrative to confront an uncomfortable possibility that power might have once been challenged in ways it could not admit. Children grew up hearing distorted versions of the story, their imaginations shaped by fragments passed down through cautious voices, turning the nameless one into a figure both feared and contemplated, an example of how human memory reshapes trauma into legend, how societies reinterpret violence into myth to make sense of the unbearable. Within this evolving narrative there existed a persistent tension, a quiet interrogation of morality, asking whether an oppressed soul seeking retribution could ever be fully condemned or fully redeemed, whether justice achieved through fear could ever truly be justice, whether the act of resistance born from suffering could be stripped of its context and judged in isolation. Every retelling carried traces of the teller's own perspective, their own relationship to power, to history, to guilt, to pain. And this is how the story transformed endlessly, mirroring the values and fears of those who kept it alive, refusing to settle into a single definitive version. Historians attempted to untangle the threads, yet found only more contradictions, more silence, more obscured detail, and the more they realized that the legend had escaped the boundaries of simple explanation, that it had become part of a broader cultural consciousness where emotion overshadowed evidence and memory outweighed documentation. In this realm, the nameless enslaved man lived on as an idea, a question carved into the margins of history, challenging the notion that all narratives belonged to the powerful, unsettling the assumption that silence meant absence, proving that even the most suppressed voices leave imprints that time cannot fully erase. Justice and vengeance circled around his legend like twin forces, inseparable and endlessly debated, and every attempt to interpret his actions revealed more about the observer than the observer, more about society's struggle to reconcile cruelty with conscience, fear with accountability, and power with humanity. The blurred line between myth and reality continued to stretch across generations, shaping perception, stirring discomfort, forcing reflection. And in that lingering uncertainty the story found its endurance, not as a concluded tale but as an unresolved echo, a living reminder that some histories resist closure, that some questions refuse simple answers, that some shadows survive precisely because they occupy the space where truth, resistance, and remembrance collide without resolution or certainty, existing only as a haunting presence that invites contemplation, challenges assumptions, and continues to breathe within the fragile silence that history never fully dared to seal away. Here is a cinematic ending to conclude the entire narrative in a powerful way, a silence heavy with unanswered questions, and histories too uncomfortable to confront, a silence that lingers in the spaces where power once stood unquestioned and now stands exposed, fragile and uncertain. The nameless shadow remains suspended between nightmare and memory, not as a celebration of bloodshed but as a reminder of what happens when cruelty is mistaken for order, and domination is confused with justice. His story stands as a warning etched into time, a reflection of a world that created its own terror and then trembled before it, proving that no amount of chains can erase consciousness, no amount of fear can fully bury truth, and no authority, no matter how absolute it believes itself to be, can silence the echoes of suffering once it has disturbed the very soul of history itself.